Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to this edition of our Brunch and Learn webinar series. We're thrilled to have you tuning in with us today and hope that you are all staying well. I am Muriel Vincent, Communications and Social Media Coordinator at the Climate Ready Project Canada, and I am joined today by one of my colleagues, Imogen Stortini, our IT and Social Media Coordinator, as well as our speaker of the hour, Clifford Maynes, Associate Program Director for Canada Walks, a program of Green Communities Canada. So this Brunch and Learn series is an opportunity for us to explore the topics covered in the National Climate League standings. The 2019 standings feature 15 primary sustainability indicators, benchmarking climate action among participating cities across Canada. It also features examples of best practices in those areas. We invite you to download the standings from ncl.climatehub.ca and to explore our webinar series at hubflix.climatehub.ca. You can find all these resources in the chat. For today's feature, we are looking forward to discussing how communities need to put walking at the top of transportation hierarchy. As a central element in a sustainable mobility future for Canada, Walkability advances most sustainable development goals, not only environment, greenhouse gases reductions, and transit success, but also health, fitness, equity, social cohesion, cultural vibrancy, and more. Today, as I mentioned before, we have the pleasure of being joined by Clifford Maynes. Clifford Maynes is Associate Program Director for Canada Walks, a program of Green Communities Canada that has pioneered walkability advocacy and capacity building in Canada. For 25 years, he was founding Executive Director of Green Communities Canada, a national umbrella for community-based environmental organizations working to achieve practical and transformational change. So I'll quickly remind everyone that you can ask questions at any time using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will visit some of these during the Q&A period following Clifford's presentation. And I also want to mention that a recording of this webinar will be made available on our YouTube channel and on our Hubflix in the days following the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today, and Clifford, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much and welcome everyone. Let's see, I'll share my screen. Okay, does that look good? Okay, I'm told I have only 15 minutes, so much to say, so I'm gonna really breeze through it and then we can have some time for discussion at the end. So the topics, I'm gonna talk generally about the role of walkability and sustainable mobility, co-benefits, creating walkable communities, what it's going to take, and then a little at the end about the politics of walking and the national active transportation strategy. So this is my impression is that the climate movement in general is fairly focused on electric vehicles and renewable energy as for the personal transportation sector. And indeed, there's a great potential to neutralize emissions from personal cars and also trucks and freight vehicle and transit. But I feel that as environmentalists, we want to look beyond that technical fix and embrace a transformative vision of an integrated and sustainable mobility future. So not just GHG reductions, GHG reductions and beyond. I think you could say that if you just do electrification, don't do anything else, it's kind of the neutron bomb of green transportation. It could eliminate GHGs if the electricity is green, but it leaves our current transportation system intact and with all of the negative aspects associated with that. Also, autonomous vehicles, I don't know if anyone's an advocate for them, but you know, I love my laptop, but I wouldn't trust it to run my car and not run over people. So I really think there's exaggerated claims being made for the safety and other benefits of AVs. And I'm kind of suspicious that there would be huge public costs involved in the kind of digital infrastructure needed to support it in urban areas. Okay, so walkability I've described as the linchpin of sustainable mobility. Um, Sustainable mobility is about an integrated approach involving multiple modes that are greener and alternatives to personal vehicle use. Transit is obviously a very big part of that. Cycling, those are the big ones. And walkability is the linchpin in the sense that it's necessary to have walkability in order to have highly successful transit and to really and to break that automobile trip chain, that dependence on the private automobile that is kind of built into our the way that our transportation system is structured, the way our communities are structured. Um, Benefits include health, fitness, happiness, contemplation, mental health, connection with our physical and natural environment, our neighbors, and our communities. There's lots that could be said about that. Prosperity as well. The economic benefits are sometimes undervalued. Certainly, there's lots of evidence that sales per square foot for retail areas in walkable regions, streets are much higher. That increasing walkability helps with neighborhood regeneration, and also large employers are increasingly aware that if they want to attract the sort of hip, young, creative types that are needed to drive the knowledge economy, they really need to provide workplaces that are in walkable areas and not out in corporate parks, where they have to eat at Montana's every day. So this is really a fairly major driver, and there's examples of big corporations moving into the urban cores for exactly this reason. So the co-benefits that I've been talking about aren't about greenhouse gases, but they are about a green future, including most of the UN Sustainable Development Goals that have been adopted by our federal government. And they're selling points for people who might not put GHG reductions at the top of their priority list. This is something in green communities we've always been really aware of, is that people have multiple hot buttons and motivations, and it's important to understand what they care about. In this case, we might get people supporting walkability for the economic development benefits. And certainly I like to cite a report by the Hamilton, Ontario Chamber of Commerce that said that walkability was a very important part of Hamilton's economic development strategy because it was necessary in order to attract the sort of employees that they need to make the transition from steel town to knowledge-based economy. So what does it take? I mean, we're really talking about a cultural shift. We're talking about a situation where for decades, pedestrians were at the bottom of the transportation hierarchy, where they're almost neglected altogether in the training for transportation engineers, for example, and in land use planning and all the rest of it. And it's really, the automobile has shaped our geography, our land use, the nature of our communities. So we really are talking about a major cultural change, a transformation. And I think it's really important to understand that's going to require a multi-dimensional strategy for changing things. So I'll quickly go through the elements. Complete streets, that the actual road right away is designed for all road users, and that certainly includes infrastructure, crossovers, mid-block crossovers, because it's often just too far to walk down to the next set of lights, and people die as a result of that. The crossing times, buttons that that are pedestrian activated, mid-road islands for for wide roads, connected network of sidewalks so you can get where you want to go, and lots of space on those sidewalks for all users. And this is particularly important as you got increasing numbers of people who are in wheelchairs or scooters. But beyond the streets themselves, there's a whole long list of supporting features that are required to make a community really truly walkable. Access to good transit, bus shelters, accessible washrooms, welcoming benches and other street furniture, wayfinding signs that tell you how long it will take in minutes to get where you're going and which direction to go, that kind of thing. These are all features. I mean, essentially what the big picture answer to the question of what will it take is what do we need as pedestrians to feel safe, for it to be an enjoyable experience, for it to be a convenient experience, for it to be a pleasant experience, all of these things. And this is what generates this long list of actions. So, streetscapes, for instance, many of our streetscapes, even in highly urbanized areas, are pretty deadly. Blank walls, mega pictures of happy shoppers blocking out store windows. Parking lots are the worst. What we do need are places, places where we want to be. Shade vegetation, art, street performers, et cetera. Human scale architecture that's meant to be experienced on foot rather than through a car window, or worse, through a helicopter. We need human scale architecture. We also need to really be concerned about the community scale land use, because for walkability to be attractive, the places we want to go have to be within walking distance. And probably most of you know about Paris committing to the 15-minute neighborhood, that everywhere you'd want to go is within 800 meters to walk. I think some people feel that maybe workplaces are obviously going to be a greater distance, but other things like shopping and services and transit stops and so on need to be nearby. And, that's as a result of the kind of land use planning that we've had that has emphasized segregation of uses and separation, and has encouraged sprawl. So in the future, we need compact mixed use development, and that includes retrofits of suburban existing areas, as well as new build. And there's lots of work that's been done on how that can be achieved. Streets need to be safe and welcoming for everybody, including women, persons of color, young, old, rich, poor. They need to be places where everyone feels safe and at home. And that's a big challenge. It obviously, we're very aware of how that is affected by policing, by social services. It's also affected by design. Streets are generally safer when there's more people on the street rather than fewer, so it's a kind of a virtuous circle. When there's eyes on the street, because the shop windows and living spaces are looking out on the street instead of them being anonymous areas. We need safer driver behavior, and that includes speed limit reductions and enforcement. But it also means, importantly, that the streets are designed not for 10, 20, 30 kilometers above the posted limit, but rather the posted limit. So they're sending visual cues to drivers about how fast it's safe to go. And then equity. Heard a webinar this week on this topic. Really very, very important to understand that, as I just said in the other slide, it's certainly not just about, the nicer, richer neighborhoods in the community, but all neighborhoods. There needs to be a real awareness of that. And there's a multi-organization initiative led by Montreal Urban Ecology, Active Neighborhoods Canada, that really gets down into working with people in a neighborhood that is underserved with active transportation infrastructure and other features, and doing community planning, participatory planning. And then finally, we need to celebrate walking and things like open street festivals. Active school travel, which our organization is very involved with, is very important because kids are being taught from a very early age to be passengers in vehicles, and they need instead to develop habits of walking and cycling on their own, independent mobility. Okay, so just to wrap up, 10 years ago, walkability was barely on the radar, certainly 15 years ago. And now there's lots of really good stuff happening, lots of organizations that support walkability, and they're across multiple sectors. We've seen improvements in walking infrastructure through as part of the addressing COVID, creating streets where there could be outdoor cafes and so on. Plans and implementation underway in many communities, but we still have a huge way to go to really make this happen, particularly across all areas of our cities and communities. And so we need more collective muscle. I mean, really, in a sense, walking is the one mode of transportation that doesn't have an organized voice at a provincial, national level in most places. In Quebec, there is a provincial organization, but overall, we're really underpowered politically. And certainly, I would love to be part of helping to create a national network to build capacity, share resources, successes, and sort of mobilize action and so on. But it's been really difficult finding the resources to do that. So if anyone has any bright ideas, please let me know. Wrap up in March, after years of us engaging and pushing for this kind of thing, the federal government is committed to develop a national active transportation strategy. And there's a picture of Andy Fillmore, the parliamentary secretary to Catherine McKenna, who says, I'm going to lead this thing. But since then, of course, that was just before the lockdown. We haven't heard anything really more other than they still intend to go ahead with it, but we have no idea about the details, and we hope to engage in particular to make sure that it is very much an implementation-focused action planning exercise and not simply a collection of aspirational statements and possible actions. So let me know if you want to stay in the loop on this. So we're hopeful that this can have a big impact in structuring, in identifying the key barriers and addressing the key barriers and incentives to accelerated progress in making Canada AT friendly, including walkability. That's it.
Thank you, Clifford, for this wonderful presentation. And I'm sure that several of your points actually resonated with our participants. So we'll now enter the Q&A portion of this webinar. And before we go on, I'd like to remind you that this webinar is 30 minutes long, but may go on a little longer if questions persist. So we had a first question coming in on urban design, actually. And it says, if walkable communities are top priority, how are cities addressing crossings and conflict points?
Yeah, I wasn't sure exactly what conflict points meant there. I mean, there are, with any cultural change at this level, there are certainly very frequently, for instance, local merchants are really concerned when pedestrian and cycling infrastructure goes in and removes even a single parking space, because historically they've had the idea that they're competing with the malls with free parking. I think now increasingly, especially after experiencing the changes, they're realizing that it's actually good for business, and people who are in their cars driving by don't buy things. It's people who are out of their cars and walking on the sidewalks who buy things. So, that's part of it. I think it is also important to flag in terms of conflicts that Canada's fortunate. We have a really positive working relationship between walking and cycling advocates, but there are countries in the world where the infrastructure is more advanced, where they are working through potential conflicts between the interests and needs of cyclists and the interests and needs of pedestrians. By and large, we're on the same page and supporting each other, but these kinds of issues need to be resolved. As for for automobiles, I mean, one positive thing is the Canadian Automobiles Association decided a long time ago to take a share the road approach. I think they were mostly concerned about cyclists, who are much better than us walkers at making noise, but in general supportive of all road users, and saying that automobiles don't own the road exclusively. So that's really positive. But there are still going to be situations where conservative-minded politicians greet every initiative as a part of a war on the car. That narrative is not lost.
Thank you, Clifford. So for our next question, this one comes from someone who seems to need a little bit more convincing on walking as the best mean of transportation. And they're asking, why choose walking over other transportation mode that are equally environmentally friendly? Should it really be one or the other? So I feel like it's more about this way of seeing transportation in like a binary way. And so it's either or, instead of thinking it in a more multimodal way, I guess.
Yes, that we're talking about the sustainable mobility is a multimodal vision. What Equiterre calls the transportation cocktail. The idea, so it's not an either or choice.
All right. We now have a question that touches more on lobbying here. And so this person said, you mentioned that the federal government wanting to develop a national active transportation strategy. I think they refer to the webinar description here. But how are provinces getting ready to make this happen at their level? And what's being done currently to develop working communities? What can citizens do to support this process? Do you have concrete examples that you would say is a step in the right direction?
Well, yeah, as I noted, I mean, some provinces in BC, I think, is one of the leaders, and are taking initiative to develop strategies at a provincial level, and I think that's great, as well as the national strategy. And many municipalities now have some kind of active transportation strategy and policy. So things are moving on that front. I don't think they've gone. I don't think they're necessarily going far enough. And certainly the federal government, for example, at the federal level, we have very poor statistics on modal share. They really tend to make walking invisible as part of the transportation system. We have no national aspirational targets for what kind of changes we want to see in modal share. So there's a large number of additional actions that need to be incorporated into a truly aggressive strategy. But meanwhile, at the community level, and there's work, all sorts of things happening that are directionally positive. Improvements in the marking of pedestrian crossovers, so that it's really highly visible to everybody and it doesn't look like an afterthought. Wider sidewalks, curb cuts, so that people using wheelchairs and carriages and so on can easily get up and down. So there's lots of improvements being made, and as I say, in some communities like my own, I live in Peterborough, car lanes were taken in order to provide more space for walking and cycling, and patios for the restaurants and so on during COVID. So there's lots of positive action out there.
Thank you, Clifford. And I think we have one last question. This one is actually a little bit funny. It's about fact-checking and kind of debunking a myth that has been circulating for a while. So there is this theory floating around saying that walking to work is actually worse for the environment somehow, and that like it's worse than, let's say, car sharing because it makes you eat more, which ultimately would lead to higher greenhouse gas emissions. So is it true?
Okay, so I'd never heard that one before, so I looked it up last night and found a good blog by a climate activist. And that depends on a couple of things. First of all, it assumes that if you go walking and burn X calories, that you will be making up those calories in additional eating. In other words, it assumes you eat less if you drive. And I'm not sure that's accurate. A lot of us, walk in part because we know we have our calorie ingestion is too great. So, but the main thing really is that it's assuming that you're eating beef. In other words, it was sort of designed to provocatively to take the most greenhouse gas intensive form of diet. So it really is saying more about our diet than it is about walking versus driving.
Well, thank you, Clifford, and that concludes our Q&A. So thank you, everyone. We had people tuning in from all across Canada, so we're very happy you were able to actually make it. And be on the lookout for new Brunch and Learn webinars. We host them every couple of weeks. If you enjoyed this presentation, you may be interested in our last webinars that was on electric vehicles and their health benefits, funny enough. But you can find it on our Hubflix. So it's on hubflix.climatehub.ca. You also have this information in the chat. And thank you all again and have a great day.
Thank you.